We're in the middle of a very severe crisis. Many countries are suffering other more severe waves of this crisis, so the economies are under a lot of pressure. And we have to start thinking about new ways of development, new ways of growth.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Alice Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel, presented by Traces.Dreams. Today, we want to talk about three very important concepts, large concepts that are related and yet distinct. And that is the issue of poverty, the issue of inequality, and the issue of growth. And to talk about that, I invited the specialist in inequality and poverty studies, the economist Eduardo Ortiz-Juarez, who is a strategic policy engagement unit economist at the UNDP, and he's also a researcher at King's College in London. Welcome to the program, Eduardo.
Thank you so much, Alice. Very happy to be here.
We're very happy to have you here because we want to know from you how we should relate these concepts and how we can differentiate these concepts that are often confused. People think that inequality is not a problem because we should concentrate on poverty, and others say, well, inequality is the problem. How do you see these concepts? How are they related? How are they distinguished?
So when thinking about these concepts, there is a debate about whether they are the same, whether we should care more about one instead of the other and less on the other. And I would say that that is a false debate. These concepts, both poverty and inequality, speaking about income only, right? Income-related inequality and income-related poverty, those concepts are different, but they are very interrelated, right? And sometimes the evidence, more often than not, has shown that positive changes in inequality, that is, a reduction in the concentration of income across the population, is usually a good strategy to also reduce poverty. And I will elaborate more on that to clarify how these mechanisms work with some examples. But for your audience, I think it's a good idea to start by defining some concepts. So if we imagine a welfare measure, income, as I said, there are two main features of that we should care about. One is concerned with the level of that income. And levels, when we are speaking about levels, that is the study that is related to the analysis of poverty. So for instance, you get certain level of income, and we usually compare that level with the value of a set of certain goods and services that are often deemed as essential for life, right? So if your income is above that level, it's usually said that you are then non-poor according to that standard, right? And of course, if you are below that, you are identified as poor. The other feature is not levels. It's about how those levels are distributed across the population, right? So if you find a society, if you look at a society, how the income is distributed across the population, you will see that there are some groups with a very high level of income, other groups with a relatively lower level of income. And then you will find that some sectors of the population are at an extremely low level of income. So let's imagine if you rank the population by level of income, you will get an increasing curve in this ordering, right? How large is the difference in the level of income between the rich or the relatively richer and the relatively poorer? That is the extent of inequality in a society, right? So you can compare that society over time, or you can compare that society and other societies, and then you can get a sense of how the distribution of income is less or more equal over time or across societies. So these concepts, they are not the same. One is about levels, the other is about the distribution, but they are deeply interconnected. And it is important to bring into the discussion a third concept, which is related with growth, the growth in that welfare measure, the growth experience in income, right? And the three concepts together form something that is called in the literature as the poverty, inequality, and growth framework. And these suffer an important framework for understanding how these things matter. So when you hear some people talking about, okay, the problem is this society is just poverty, we shouldn't care about inequality, that is a false statement, right? These concepts are deeply interconnected. So and we will illustrate that with some examples. It matters, I think, especially when in policy discussion, we should pay attention to both concepts, right? Because, for instance, there are some evidence in which I have been involved in America, specifically, in which we observe over the decade between 2003 and 2013, Latin America experienced an important reduction in poverty. And when we analyze and explain what were the main components of that reduction, the analysis, the evidence suggests that about a third of the poverty reduction that many countries in Latin America experienced was explained by also a decline in inequality. So when you are looking at poverty and inequality and growth, and what many people, many analysts, several economists are just caring about, yeah, let's make the economy grow, let's expand the income, let's put all the efforts in growth. That is not the only concern, right? So growth is important, it's an important component of this triangle, but here is where inequality matters. It is not just about the growth in incomes. It is about, or the growth in the economy. So that is an important element, and it's a necessary condition, right, for poverty reduction, but it is not the only one. You need to pay attention and correct eventually how that growth occurs across the population, right? It is not the same that an economy expands by, I don't know, 6%, if most of that growth translates into growth in incomes only about the richer member of the societies, right? So consider three stylized examples, right? You can observe, for instance, that what happened in Latin America, right? Poverty is reducing at the same time that inequality is also declining. So that could be the result of the incomes of the poor people growing at a higher rate than those among the richer members of the society. So you are improving the inequality, the distribution of income, but also you are making that the incomes of the poor are taking some people out of poverty, right? So in that case, you have both concepts moving in the same direction. But you could also have that an opposite result. For instance, the incomes of the poor could be increasing as a result of some transfers or as a result of economic growth, but they are increasing at a relatively lower rate, so that it is not enough to to reduce much poverty. Perhaps it is enough to take some people out of poverty, but the growth in income is occurring at a higher rate at the top of the distribution. So in that case, yeah, you could also have some reduction in poverty, but in particular, you could have, or you will certainly have, an increase in inequality, and then you will have those concepts moving in the opposite, right? A negative outcome. You can have poverty increasing, inequality increasing, in which case mainly those households and individuals at the top of the distribution are capturing all the gains of economic growth, right? Whereas those at the bottom they are getting almost nothing from that growth. So this is the relationship. So it is important to note that growth matters in this relationship, matters a lot in the relationship between poverty and inequality, but it is not only growth per se. It how that growth occurs and how it benefits the different members of the society. Something that in the literature we refer to as the incidence of growth. I would like to add, sorry if I am taking more time to answer just a simple question. I would like to add another component. It is often forgotten in these narratives. It is not just how growth occurs, but what also matters, and this is connected with the research I've been involved in Mexico. I can talk about it a bit later, but what matters a lot is the initial condition of the living standards in general, right? And by the initial condition, I'm talking about the point in time in which you are starting the assessment, right? So, for instance, if inequality is very high in a society, you need to grow a lot in order to achieve poverty reduction, right? Perhaps this is clearer with another example. So let's imagine two societies, right? Two different economies where both grow at some rate, but both societies achieve, I don't know, 1,000 pesos in gains in general. That is the growth that both experience, right? What happens in the first society if only, for instance, the poorest half of the population gets only 10% of that growth? That is, that part of the society will accrue only 100 pesos, 100 pesos. The other society, the poorest half, will get 40% of that growth. So that is 400 pesos will be accrued by the poor. So the next year, when growth occurs, the first society needs to grow at a more rapid pace, at a higher rate, in order for the poorest to benefit. So that the high level of inequality, in which only the poorest population is benefiting by 10%, that level of inequality is constraining the potential of poverty reduction that could be achieved by growth. So you need to grow more at a higher rate in order to achieve poverty reduction. And we all know that growth is not an easy task, right? In particular, I'm from Mexico. You work in Mexico, and in Mexico, we haven't experienced growth for a lot of time, significant growth, I mean.
So what are we left to do then? If there is no growth, how can we deal with we still have inequality and we still have poverty. We just don't have growth. So what is there to be done then?
Redistribution policies. That is the main instrument, right? The fiscal system, it's perhaps one of the most powerful tools for achieving a better distribution of income, but at the same time, it could be one of the main sources of inequalities, right? So if we think about if we think about a context in which taxes on wealth, on capital, are relatively low, and the system is more dependent on indirect taxation, such as BIT taxes, in Mexico, the famous IVA or something like that, sales taxes. I mean, those taxes, while they are necessary and they are perhaps the easiest way to collect income, they are at the same time particularly harmful for the poorest members of the society. So what you need to do, if you have no growth and you also have a very regressive system and a quite fragile system of taxation and redistribution, then you need a very comprehensive set of reforms. I think that you have a lot to do using the fiscal tools through social spending and through a more equitable and progressive taxation in the absence of growth. If you also have growth as a result of other policies, economic policies, etc., institutional reform, institutional strengthening, governance, rule of law, that would be the best, of course, right? Because it is not just about, the experience has shown it is not about trickle-down economics and let's grow and that will benefit. We don't have growth in many countries, so we need to do more, right?
Trickle down, the idea being that the wealthiest will spend their money that they get from growth, and eventually that will benefit everybody, right?
Exactly.
Which has
that is the promise, right? And that has been the flagship of these several reforms that we implemented during the 80s. Eventually, all the members of the society will benefit from that, and we haven't experienced that. And what is perhaps concerning now in many countries is that we are moving. We're in the middle of a very severe crisis, right? Many countries are just suffering other more severe waves of this crisis, so the economics are under a lot of pressure, no space, and we have to start thinking about new ways of development, new ways of growth, right? So rich countries are talking already about how to transition to greener economies, and then we have to move to that end. But here I think that there will be eventually, and I am not necessarily informed about this, but I think that eventually there will be an important normative debate about, okay, you already experience growth, you already polluted, you are rich, right? But whereas there are a lot of the poorest countries, they will demand space to develop.
I'd like to come back to something that you said before about the poverty reduction. You mentioned that there was an important poverty reduction strain in Latin America in the last decade. And before, of course, now there is an increasing poverty situation again due to the pandemic predominantly and some other factors. But before we come to that, could you explain a little bit more about how that poverty reduction materialized, what the factors behind it were? I know you did some studies in the south of Mexico on the poverty reduction that occurred here. Could you tell a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I've been involved. I've been working mainly in poverty inequality issues, middle class issues as well. But specifically on this, I had the opportunity to collaborate with two very famous economists in the region. Together, we wrote perhaps a couple of papers trying to analyze what were the main drivers of this poverty reduction and the inequality reduction as well. And what we observed is, in terms of poverty, poverty. The main factors behind the decline, the reduction of poverty, were an increase in labor incomes, mainly as a result of this context, a very dynamic context of commodity-led exports, etc., and crucially, and this is connected with the use of the fiscal system to improve these issues, crucially by a very aggressive social policy across the region, right? This was not only about cash transfers, that of course was the main component, right? But there were also investment and a lot of spending in non-contributory pensions for the elderly. But there were also important investments in the previous years in the coverage of education, so that by the time of the commodity boom, Latin America had a relatively more educated people, in particular at the bottom of the distribution, who benefited from increasing earnings. If you decompose, and there are some techniques, so you can compare what was the level of poverty in 2003, let's say that in Latin America, when the commodity boom started, and focus on 2010, 2013, you can decompose that by changing the distribution, by seeing how growth occurs. We won't enter into that detail here. But mainly you can get two components. One is the growth effect that explains the reduction of poverty, and the other is the distribution effect. So, as I said at the beginning, a third of the reduction of poverty was accounted by an improved distribution of income. So what we experienced in Latin America in terms of poverty was mainly a growth component as a result of the growth in earnings, mainly, which is an important component of total income in the household, right? And the other component was a better redistribution. But also, it's important to know the growth component, it is not just about growth that occurs in the market, right? It's not about growth in earnings. Income growth can also occur because you also receive the transfer from the government. So that adds on top of that, right? So it's an interplay of both components. And what I think it is important to highlight as well, I mean, again, poverty reduced in Latin America because of growth, and a third of that was accounted for a better redistribution, both by the public institutions, by social policy, fiscal policies, and by market dynamics. What it is also important to note, so is that inequality declined. And inequality was not only one of the drivers behind poverty reduction. A better income distribution was achieved, again, by a more active social policy, but critically by these factors that I mentioned before. Those investments that occur in terms of coverage in education, right, eventually benefited a lot of the population at a time when this dynamic context landed in Latin America, and particularly benefited Latin America because the the productive composition of in many Latin American countries, in most of the region, is commodities, right? So we experienced a boom of that, that benefited a lot of countries, of course, with some heterogeneities across them. In the case of Mexico, is more, it's less commodity led, it's more industrial manufacture. South America is, and the Andean countries are more commodity oriented countries, and in particular in those countries we observe the most dramatic reductions in poverty and inequality. And what it is important to mention as well is that not only poverty decreased. When you look at, okay, what happened with all the people who moved out of poverty, so a significant part of these people reached a more secure, a more economically secure position, which some authors call, and I include myself there, called the middle class. It is not necessarily the middle class. I'm not talking about the middle class with brilliant sociologists, but let's say the middle, more secure strata. But it is important to know that not all the people moved to that position, right? Some people just move above the poverty line in what a colleague and myself in a paper we call the vulnerable to poverty. They are no longer poor. They benefited in the short term by these increases in earnings, by this increase in income. They benefited from this active social policy and they move just above the poverty line, but they are not necessarily secure. And precisely these people, look, if you imagine this group of the population, given the level of informality in many countries in Latin America, right? So they are not part of this labor, the formal labor market linked social protection, right? So they are excluded from that. They are most of them in informality, and because they are no longer poor, almost by definition, they are not necessarily benefiting anymore from social assistance. And so eventually they cross the poverty line, but they don't have protection, right? They don't have a more secure position. And these populations, there are several, um, I won't say several, but there are some indications that these people, not only in Latin America, in many parts of the world, are the ones who are specifically in this context falling back into poverty, right? Given the level of informality combined with the type of mitigation policies, so you have to stay at home. So 50% of the workers in Latin America, they cannot work from home. They are in informal activities. They have to go outside, and they don't have social protection, right? So perhaps many of these people, not only in Latin America, in many countries, in Africa, in South Asia, these are the ones who are the groups of people who are potentially falling back into poverty. The official statistics in Mexico over the long run, say 1992, 2018, 2016, 2014, and you look at the poverty headcount ratio, what you will observe is that nothing has happened in this country in 2 decades, right? Even though, yeah, poverty increased after the tequila crisis, then declined or reduced consistently up to 2006, and then it started to increase again. But if you look specifically at these 2 points, you will say, well, nothing has happened in this country. And if you look at the performance of the GDP per capita, nothing has happened. GDP per capita has expanded at less than 1% on average annually since 1992 up to 2014, 2015. What we did was using some methodologies, try to impute the incomes from the survey into the censuses, using the censuses from 1990, 2000, 2005, 2010, 2014, and we are waiting for the new one, for the latest one to update this. And we constructed this panel data set of municipalities. It's about 2,400 municipalities, which are comparable across time. This is a unique data set. And what we did was then to try to unpack those dynamics. So the first question is, what has happened with the regional disparities in terms of income, right? And what we observe is that indeed something has happened in Mexico. The poorest municipalities have catch up with the richer content, even though at the aggregate level nothing has happened, right? So the poorest municipalities have catch up to the richer one. What we observe, there are 2 things that are worth highlighting. Poorest municipalities experience growth, whereas the richer were decreasing or stagnating. But why the poorest municipalities experience growth? And what we observe, and this is a quite important finding, is that the most accelerated pace of convergence occurred between 2000 and 2005, which was the time when conditional cash transfers in Mexico, the Progresa Oportunidades program, was expanding at an annual rate of 30% in the coverage. And the priority was the most marginalized communities in the country and the poorest households. And we observed that, yes, in among the poorest municipalities, the growth in incomes as a result of the expansion of cash transfers and the federal transfers from Ramo 33, etc., translated into poverty reduction. But if you start very poor, the ability for you to translate that growth into poverty reduction is really complex. And what we observe in our findings is that starting out very poor in Mexico in 2000 was actually a positive start, right? I mean, not like that, but the finding is that those municipalities that started really poor, they experience growth as a result of cash transfers and federal transfers in such a magnitude that they overcome that barrier of initial poverty, and they manage to indeed reduce extreme poverty and to explain this process of poverty convergence that we found.
Why do you think we should research these things further ahead, or what got you interested in looking at these questions in the first place?
Personally, I am. I mean, I don't want to sound cheesy, but
Go ahead.
personally, and I personally, I'm truly passionate about exploring or trying to explain what are the mechanisms and what are the forces from the policy area that could exert some positive changes among the population. I mean, for me, and I think that in general, we as researchers or policymakers in whatever field, but particularly in this, if you don't have a question that is policy relevant, this is my opinion. I'm not judging. I'm not. Please, this you have to have a question that is policy relevant, that is amenable from the policy arena. Yes, I know how to do some methods. I know how to propose or to measure some aspects. That is cool. I mean, yeah, you publish a paper and you get some citations and blah blah blah. That's nice. I mean, this is what we do. But at the end, is I think that for me the most relevant part is to be able to translate this research into something useful, something that could be applied. I am not, at the same time, I am not naive, and yeah, I will do this research and this paper and everything will be fine. No, I mean, sometimes you have to deal with a lot of complexities and with a lot of other dynamics from the policy sphere. But for me, being cheesy is to try to do something that at some point improves the living conditions of the population.
Thank you so much, Eduardo, for enlightening us on the connection and disconnection between poverty, inequality, growth, and the incidence of growth. How all these important factors can or cannot relate depending on circumstances, depending on the policy space, depending on what is done externally and internally in a country context. Thank you all for watching another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Alice Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel. And if you're interested in these subjects, please subscribe to our channel so you can have another episode fresh off next week. And we hope to see you again soon. Have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.